Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to study Job 26 and learn about exiting an unresolvable disagreement. The Bible tells us when Job was unable to convince his friends they were falsely accusing him of sin, he exited the dialogue with the statement that once they died, all their mistakes would be exposed by God. For us, this raises the question of whether or not that is a correct assumption for us when we are falsely accused or find ourselves in an unresolvable disagreement. In this video, we're going to learn that we can count on the fact that someday the Lord will return and make known the truth. Now let's start with some background to today's passage, and let's summarize the story of Job. At the beginning of Job's story, Job was healthy, wealthy, blameless, and upright. And there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan. And Yahweh bragged about Satan and pointed out how Job was blameless and upright. Satan responded that the only reason Job followed God was because Job was wealthy. Satan said if Job lost all his possessions, then he would curse God. So Yahweh gave Satan permission to test Job. So Satan went out and destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. While Job did not curse God, Job stayed loyal to God. As Job was suffering, three friends named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar went to visit Job, and they went to sympathize with him and comfort him. And there was a long dialogue between these four men. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, and that pattern kept continuing. And the general gist of this dialogue was the three friends tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. The three friends believed that God was fair. Therefore, since Job was suffering, he must have done something to deserve the suffering. Meanwhile, Job kept insisting that he was innocent, and Job kept insisting that he was suffering unjustly and that God was against him for some reason. So this dialogue went on, and this box here represents Job 26. And at that point, these men had not reached an agreement on this, and they had basically come to a point where it was an unresolvable disagreement. What we're going to look at today is Job chapter 26, represented by this little box here. And essentially, Job is going to tell his friends that someday, once they all died, Yahweh was going to point out the truth to all of them. Now, with that as a background, let's get into Job chapter 26, starting at verse 1. Then Job responded, "What a help you are to the weak, how you have saved the arm without strength." Now, let's start with the pronoun you. In English, we cannot differentiate between a singular you or a plural you. In Hebrew, they could. And in Hebrew, this pronoun is singular, so it probably refers to Bildad because Bildad is the one who had been speaking in the previous chapter. Now, Job was being sarcastic here. Job really meant that Bildad was not being a help to the weak, and he meant that Bildad was not saving the arm that did not have strength. I mentioned a little bit earlier, Job 2 verse 11 tells us that these three men went to visit Job to sympathize with him and comfort him, but it's obvious here that Job did not think that they were sympathetic nor helpful nor comforting. Let me also point out that this was somewhat common as you read through Job and read this dialogue for these friends to trade insults like this. Now let's go on to verse 3. And again, this is Job speaking to his friends, specifically to Bildad. "What counsel you have given to one without wisdom? What helpful insight you have abundantly provided." Now again, Job was being sarcastic, and he believed that Bildad was not giving good counsel nor good insight. Verse 4. "To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit was expressed through you?" Now, these were rhetorical questions, and the answer was no one. To whom have you uttered words? No one. Whose spirit was expressed through you? No one. And let's look at this a little closer. Whose spirit was expressed through you? no one. Job meant that when Bildad spoke, Bildad was on his own. There wasn't some spirit that was speaking through Bildad. Therefore, Bildad was speaking on his own, and Bildad did not have the authority to say the things that he was saying. And by extension, Bildad and his friends, Job was saying that Bildad and his friends did not have the authority to say that what they were saying, which was that Job was suffering because he had sinned. Verse 5. The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Now, the phrase departed spirits is a reference to dead people. And notice that Job and his friends believed that dead people existed under the waters. Dead people tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Their inhabitants refers to sea creatures. And notice the word tremble. Job said that dead people tremble. Verse 6 is going to explain why Job believed that. Verse 6. Naked is Sheol before him, and Abaddon has no covering. Now let's talk about the word Sheol first of all. Job and his friends believed that Sheol is where people went when they died. And that's clear when we look at this in a few other passages. So let's look at Proverbs 5:5. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. Now this is Hebrew poetry, and unlike English poetry, which is about rhyme, Hebrew poetry is not about rhyme. Hebrew poetry was about addition, repetition, and contrast. And this is an example of repetition. What happened in repetition was a Hebrew poet would make a statement and then say the same thing in a different way. And that's what he's doing here. He's saying, her feet go down to death. In other words, she died. Her steps take hold of Sheol. Sheol is the same thing as death, and so this is another way of saying that she died. And so we see that death and Sheol are the same thing. This is also true in Isaiah 28:15. Because you had said, quote, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. Again, this is Hebrew poetry. This is repetition. We have made a covenant with death is the same thing as we have made a pact with Sheol. And so we see that death and Sheol are the same thing. So now let's go back to this passage in Job. The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Naked is Sheol before him, and Abaddon has no covering. Let's look at the word Abaddon. Abaddon is also a term for Sheol, or another term for death. Let's look at a couple other verses to see that. This is Job 28:22. Abaddon and death say. Notice the word and. The word and means that Abaddon and death are the same thing. And then we look at Proverbs 15:11. Sheol and Abaddon lie open before the Lord. Again, notice the word and. Sheol and Abaddon are the same thing. And so Sheol and Abaddon are other terms for death. Now let's go back to our passage in Job 26. Again, let's read verses 5 and 6. The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Naked is Sheol before God, and Abaddon has no covering. Now, notice the phrase, naked is Sheol. And let's think about the concept of nakedness. When people are naked, they are aware that all of their bodily flaws and imperfections are exposed and fully on display. What Job meant here was when he said that Sheol is naked, he meant that when people die, they are aware that they are exposed. Dead people are aware that all of their flaws and sins and motives and everything from life are now exposed. Well, the question is, exposed to who? We have the pronoun him. Now, typically you look at a pronoun and you go back in previous verses to see who that refers to, but there's really nothing in the previous verses to indicate who this refers to. And so as we look at the context, I think the most logical conclusion is the pronoun him refers to God. And so Job said, naked is Sheol before God. In other words, when people die, they're naked before God, which means that dead people are aware that God knows all of their faults, their sins, their bad motives, bad intentions, bad thoughts, sinful thoughts, everything. They realize God is aware of all of that. Now, once again, remember this is Hebrew poetry, and he said Abaddon has no covering. This is the same thing as saying naked is Sheol. Sheol is naked, Abaddon is naked. Sheol has no covering, Abaddon has no covering. Again, the point is when people die, they are very aware that God knows all of their faults, all of their sins, and all of their motives. Now, why did Job say all this? How does this fit into this dialogue between him and his friends? Well, if you remember, throughout this dialogue, Job's friends had been trying to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned, and Job disagreed. And we saw in previous verses that Job told his friends that they were not being very helpful. And then we also saw that Job had pointed out to Bildad that he didn't have the authority to say the things that he was saying. And the reason Job said this was to point out to Bildad and also to his friends that someday they were going to die. And when they died, then all of a sudden they were going to be aware of how wrong they were, because once they were dead and were aware that God knew everything about them, then they would realize how wrong they were about Job. Now, let's also keep in mind that we cannot base our beliefs on the afterlife on these verses. Job was not the author of Job, and so Job was not inspired. Job was not inerrant in what he said. The author of Job merely recorded what Job said, and the author does not necessarily intend for us to agree with Job. What we need to do is look at other verses in the Bible to see whether or not Job was correct, and we'll do that a little bit later. Now, we're going to continue on in this passage in verse 7. In the following verses, Job described God's power. For example, verse 7. God stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. Here we see that we see the phrase hangs the earth, and basically Job gave God credit for creating the earth. Verse 8. God wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them. Here, Job gave God credit for creating clouds and filling them with water. Verse 9. God obscures the face of the full moon and spreads his cloud over it. Here, Job gave God credit for obscuring the moon with cloud cover. Verse 10. God has inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. The word circle refers to the horizon, so here Job gave God credit for creating the horizon. Verse 11. The pillars of heaven tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. The word tremble refers to thunder. Verse 12. God quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Notice the word breath. That's a reference to wind. And so here Job gave God credit for creating the wind that clears the clouds out of the sky. And verse 14. Behold, these are the fringes of his ways, and how faint a word we hear of him. But as mighty thunder, who can understand? Now notice here the pronoun these. The pronoun these refers to everything Job had said in these previous verses about God's power. And then notice the word fringes. Job meant that everything Job had just said about God's power was a small part of the truth about God's power. In other words, God was much more powerful than what Job had just described, and perhaps even what Job was even capable of describing. Now, why did Job make these statements about God's power? And, how did this fit into this whole dialogue between Job and his friends? Now remember, throughout this dialogue, Job's friends had been trying to convince Job he was suffering because he had sinned. Job disagreed and told his friends they were not being very helpful. And then we saw earlier in this passage that Job pointed out that Bildad did not have the authority to say the things he was saying about Job. And Job also pointed out that when they all died, God was going to make clear to them the truth. And from Job's perspective, God was going to make clear to Bildad and his friends that they were wrong about Job. I think here, Job was describing God's power just to point out to his friends that God has the power to make known the truth. In other words, Job believed he was innocent. Job believed that someday God would make known to his friends that they were wrong about Job. And here Job was pointing out that God has the power to be able to do that. Now, as I said earlier, we cannot base our beliefs about God or his power on what Job said. the author of Job was merely recording what Job said. The author did not necessarily intend for us to agree with what Job said. Now, verse 14 is the end of this particular speech of Job's. It's the end of chapter 26. And so let's go back to verses 5 and 6. And again, this was Job speaking to his friends. The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Naked is Sheol before God, and Abaddon has no covering. And again, notice the word naked. As I had said earlier, when dead people reach Sheol, all their thoughts and motives are exposed before God. And that was what Job believed. Now, was Job correct? And if so, how does this affect us when we are in an unresolvable disagreement? Job found himself in an unresolvable disagreement, and the way he began to exit himself from that disagreement was to simply resort to the ultimate judgment by God. And so, is that something we can do? Was Job correct about this? Well, let's take a look at Proverbs 16, verse 2. All the ways of a man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the motives. Notice the word motives. Here it's clear that Yahweh looks at the motives of people. Also, 1 Samuel 16:7. This was a verse from when Samuel had gone to anoint a king. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And notice the word heart. Again, we see that there's a clear statement here that Yahweh looks at a man's heart. And then let's look at 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5. Therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts, and then each man's praise will come to him from God. Now notice the phrase, or really a command, wait until the Lord comes. Someday the Lord will come. There's a command here to wait until he comes. Notice the word both. When the Lord comes, he's going to do two things. First, he's going to bring to light the things hidden in the darkness. And so we as humans, we go through life and we think we're doing things that nobody knows and nobody sees. But the Lord is going to bring all those things to light. Second, the Lord is going to disclose the motives of men's hearts. So again, as we go through life, we have thoughts and values and motives inside of us. We think nobody knows what they are. But God knows what they are, and he's going to disclose them. And so as we look at this, we see that Job was correct. When Job used this image of nakedness and said that dead people are naked, that's more or less what's being described here, that when the Lord comes, all of a sudden all of our actions, all of our thoughts and motives are going to be exposed, and we're going to feel that we are naked. Now, again, Job had also said, dead people tremble. And there's some verses in Revelation that sort of give us a picture into that. And let's take a look at that. This is a passage, Revelation 1, verses 13 and onward, where John saw a vision in heaven. And the pronoun I refers to John. I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe, reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it has been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining in its strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. And notice this last verse. John fell at his feet like a dead man. John was so overwhelmed by the reality of who God is that he fell at God's feet like a dead man. And so we see that Job was correct. Job was correct in this concept of when people die, they're naked before God. All of their actions and thoughts are exposed. And we see that Job was correct in this concept of dead people trembling. When we as humans suddenly are face to face with God, we're going to be aware that all of our sins, all of our deeds, all of our actions, motives, everything, we're going to realize that God knows all of it. And when that happens, perhaps we're going to be so overwhelmed by that reality that we're going to fall at God's feet like a dead man. So, what does this mean for us when we are in an unresolvable disagreement? Well, as I said, Job's friends tried to convince Job he was suffering because of sin. Job knew he was innocent. Job and his friends had argued back and forth multiple times, but Job had been unable to convince his friends of his innocence, so it became an unresolvable disagreement. Job started to exit his unresolvable disagreement by pointing out that someday God would make known the truth. And we saw that Job was correct about this. And so, if we find ourselves in an unresolvable disagreement, if we find ourselves being falsely accused, perhaps we need to look at it the same way Job did. If we're falsely accused and we know we're right, but we can't persuade our opponent that we're right, then at some point we simply need to remind ourselves that God knows the truth, and someday He is going to return and He's going to make known the truth. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.